posted on our website, so people can retrieve it later if they need to use it with Teams or anything like that. So again, welcome. This is going to be the first of several Tier 2 online technical assistance sessions for schools that have been trained and implementing for a little bit and kind of want to just get back to some basics and have some conversations about their systems or the interventions and kind of some of the behind the scenes things. My name is Kent Smith. I'm one of the Regional Technical Assistance Coordinators for the Wisconsin RTI Center PBIS network. I support schools in CSAs 4, 10, and 11, so the western side of the state. Also facilitating today is...
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. This is Emilie O'Connor. I work with Kent, and I'm a Regional Technical Assistance Coordinator in the Southeast region. So that is primarily CSA number 1.
The sessions that we've built really have 3 main goals that we're trying to get at. To help participants review elements of their Tier 2 supports, help schools gain deeper adaptive understanding about their Tier 2 supports, and help participants connect with other implementing schools. So really what we're looking for is trying to get beyond the training material itself. So moving beyond the technical aspects of, how do we build our Tier 2? What are the things that need to be in place on a DPR form? Who is a check-in, check-out greeter, to really understanding the behind the scenes things, how our building is going to be different once we implement Tier 2, kind of what the emphasis, the focus of the interventions are, rather than just sort of the nuts and bolts pieces of it. This is kind of moving to the hearts and minds and kind of thinking about sustainability, not just implementation. So all of these focus areas are going to be at play in all of the sessions that we're going to be doing over the next several times we meet. With today in particular, what we're really going to look at are the intent behind the Tier 2 supports within the PBIS framework, the connections to the universal system, and to some extent the Tier 3 systems. So where are we coming from and where are we going as we're thinking about Tier 2? And then discussing data rules for entry into support, progress monitoring, and decision making as they link back especially to Tier 1. So these are the 3 main things that we're going to focus on for the next about 50 minutes. And we are going to reserve some time at the end for questions, for sharing. If you got some things that are going on in your building that you're really proud of and that you want to share, that would also be fantastic, because we want schools to be able to connect with each other as well. Emilie, anything you want to add before I jump in?
Sorry, no, I don't think so, except that if you do have questions or, things come up for you as we go, please feel free to chat them into the box so that we can respond to them. We're a small enough group today that we can respond to them as we go. The other thing is, Robert, welcome. I am hoping that you would be able to chat your name, your role, your school, and your district into the chat box, just so that we can capture everyone that has joined us. And if anybody's in the room with you, like they are in Nina, if there's multiple people in the room, just let us know who's there with you. Thanks.
Thanks. So as we start moving into the meat of this session, there are a couple of things that we wanted to really kind of go back to basics with and start thinking about. And really that is kind of, why are we doing Tier 2? What's the point of it? Early on when schools are implementing just Tier 1, there is a desire to start moving into Tier 2 because we got some kids that are struggling or they really, really need it. Tier 2 may be perceived as sort of more consequence, or it may be viewed as, closer support for the kid that needs a little bit more. But when we think about what Tier 2 is intended to do, the supports that are put into place, the interventions that are put into place at Tier 2 provide the student with additional practice. So assuming that our universal system is functioning well and that we have taught to fluency the things that we expect, the behaviors we expect in the settings, then for the student that needs a little bit more, one of the things that Tier 2 does is allows us to provide the student with additional chances to practice, to help master that skill, to acquire it. It provides a chance for additional reinforcement. So if you think back to your universal, the acknowledgement system that was put into place at Tier 1 was intended to help build a positive environment and help focus on positive connections between the student and the teacher and the school. But as we were teaching new skills, or as we were teaching the skills in the setting, the acknowledgement system was also being used to help with skill acquisition, right? So as we were teaching the skill, the acknowledgement system was used to focus the adults on catching the students doing it right, being able to call attention to the desired behavior, and help make that behavior stronger. When we start thinking about Tier 2, and we start thinking about how we deliver feedback within our Tier 2 supports, part of what ends up happening is giving the student a higher rate of feedback to help with that skill acquisition and to help the student understand that they really are getting it, that they're able to do the behaviors that we're looking for, that they actually are kind of meeting those expectations. But that acknowledgement happens at a higher rate. So at Tier 1, we talk about, trying to get to a 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio. As the student is moving into Tier 2 supports, we want to be seeing that rate of acknowledgement increasing, probably about 10-to-1. This doesn't mean people necessarily walking around with their pockets bulging with caught being good cards, but it does mean that as we're having interactions with the students, we're giving them behaviorally specific feedback at a much higher rate. That they were demonstrating responsibility in the classroom or in the setting the way that we taught it, nice job, way to go. So trying to do this at a much higher rate to help with that skill acquisition, because they're also getting additional practice. When we talk about Tier 2 supports as well, we're also providing additional connections for the student. So when we think about a student entering into check and check out supports, part of those connections come in through also having a greeter, somebody that they meet with at the beginning and at the end of the day to help them sort of enter in and exit from the day back into their life with their family, into the community, kind of a person to start the day with positive momentum, to give the student a soft landing. Just really somebody that's there that says, hey, I'm happy to see you, and is able to kind of greet the student with unconditional positive regard. As we move through Tier 2, we also want to make sure that we're thinking about support in terms of differentiation. So when our Tier 2 system is built, we do identify sort of a generic or a basic intervention that most students, almost all students, are going to begin with, something like check in, check out. But if we're seeing a student needing more than check in, check out, part of what we're looking at through the data is what next? How do we provide additional support to the student? So we want to be thinking about the student's behavior and what the data is telling us and their successes or their areas for growth in terms of whether they're showing us a skill deficit, a performance deficit, or an engagement motivation kind of concern. So the things that come next, we want to be thinking about from a critical eye of what need do we need to support versus Timmy's just being naughty, right? Tier 2 is not we have to try all 4 of these different interventions in sequence. It really is sort of what's our entry point, and then how do we differentiate based on need. And then we also want to be thinking about our Tier 2 supports from an early and preventive standpoint. So when schools are trained, we spend a lot of time talking about the triangle, and we talk about, what Tier 1 looks like in terms of ODR, Tier 2 looks like in terms of ODR, 2 to 5 office discipline referrals kinds of things. What we want to make sure that we're doing is setting a data point or a data rule that is low enough that allows us to find the students that are needing support early rather than the students that are struggling with severe or more habitual behaviors. So we're trying to find the students earlier. We're trying to find the students before problems are becoming real chronic and real severe. Emilie, anything you want to add before I move on?
No, I think that's great. I think the other piece that I heard you pull out was just that increased connection with adults, which is so critical and oftentimes overlooked. That interaction, that relational piece is so critical because behavior doesn't change in isolation. It's changed in relation with other people and within the context that it's happening in. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about what Tier 2 supports are intended to do. We want to also spend some time talking about what Tier 2 is not. So Tier 2 is not providing more significant consequence when a student has a behavior error. It's not a set of punishments. It's not a precursor to special education referral. So in other words, it's not saying, well, if Tier 2 doesn't work, we move to special education referral. And it's not something that keeps students out of intervention. So when we think about what it is, those additional chances to practice, that additional reinforcement, all of those good things, those additional connections, and we talk about what it's not, really Tier 2 is not the student has an error, so we're going to call in the brute squad and we're going to kind of get the kid wrapped up. We're really trying to build fluency and help mastery and help skill acquisition. When we talk about things like interventions themselves, there's a mind shift that happens with that Tier 2, that we really are wanting to find students and get them involved with support earlier, rather than saying, well, we really don't want to put Timmy in check and check out because, well, intervention. We really do want to find students and get them in earlier rather than waiting for things to start kind of cooking. The other thing we want to think about is how data works in this. And specifically, we want to be thinking about data driving the Tier 2 supports. So we've talked about this idea of finding students for Tier 2. So how do we find students? What does finding them look like? Who are the students we should be looking for? If our Tier 1 is working well, we should be seeing about 80–85% of students not needing additional support. This means that we're teaching the fluency, the behaviors that we expect in the settings we expect to see them in. We understand that behavior error occurs and that it's not unreasonable to expect a student to be retaught a couple times. So that 80–85% is really that thing that we're looking for to determine how robust, how healthy our universal system is. What we're concerned about is that 20% of students that are needing something more, right? And when we start seeing those students, how early do we want to intervene? How early do we want to scoop them up and plug them into support systems? So students with multiple Tier 1 behavior errors. So this isn't a hard and fast rule. This is sort of a ballpark to get you thinking about how does our universal function, what is typical, but think around things like 6 minors or 2 office discipline referrals, students with multiple unexcused absences, so 3, 4, 5, students that are struggling with some minor organizational or academic skills. So the student that we know Tier 1 isn't quite clicking for because they've surfaced a little bit, those are the students that we're really kind of thinking about how do we scoop them up, how do we find them, how do we plug them into intervention. It's not intended as the initial and sole support for a student with severe and chronic behavior needs. So we may have a student who moves into our building who is climbing on the bookcase, is throwing the globe, is peeing on the smartboard, and is biting people, right? We're not going to say, oh, but our process says Timmy has to stay in check out for 6 weeks before we do anything else. We're going to want to provide support for that student based on what we see from the student, but we also want to make sure that we are involving them in that Tier 2 support system. So having them be a part of check out, having them work with a greeter, having them get feedback over the course of the day with a daily progress report, are all things that, as we're designing support for the student with those severe and critical needs, we're going to be able to harness, right? We're not having to build a completely separate support system. But we also want to be able to respond to what the student is showing us, and we want intervention intensity to match intensity of need. So we should have a data rule that allows us to quickly, efficiently, and effectively identify the student that is eligible or is ideal for Tier 2 supports. So at the bottom of the slide, what you see is a statement to the effect that a student is eligible for Tier 2 supports if they have blank, what is your data point, in a 30-day period. And as a team, you want to have multiple avenues for entry into this. So maybe you have a data rule for entry in based on minors. Maybe you have a data point for entry in based on unexcused absences. So you want to be thinking about kind of those factors that are critical for success in your building, and how do we know when students are getting it? So what does responding to that universal mean? And how do we identify the students that are just beginning to experience difficulty that we need to help kind of address early rather than later? I think, Emilie, this is you. I will take over the chat box.
Sure. So I think, like Kent said, so much of this is based on what you've set up within your school. So much of this is based on, your data rules, and being eligible for Tier 2 supports is going to be based on your minors, your major collection, your staff understanding around that, your staff consistency with that. And so that's an opportunity to really examine, what's going on, what students are we seeing meeting criteria? Is it, do our data rules only capture those kids that are throwing the globe in the room and tearing down the smartboard, et cetera? Or are we really able, like Ken said, to scoop them up early on? And is our data system sensitive enough to do that? Is our data collection on par in giving us that kind of information earlier on? And that's an ongoing reflection and communication with that Tier 1 team and your Tier 2 team. So I guess before we click to the next slide, I'm wondering what kind of questions have come up at this point, for Robert in Sturgeon Bay or for the ladies in Neenah? Are there questions that have come up, or just, kind of thoughts in terms of current status of your Tier 2 and what Kent just described as kind of the purpose, the intent, and what Tier 2 is or is not within your building? So I don't know, I think you are not muted. Are people muted? Everybody's not muted, correct? So Heather or Robert or Lena, any thoughts you have at this point?
No,
Hi, this is Robert.
Go ahead, Robert. Why don't you go, and then we'll go with Heather and Elena.
In Sturgeon Bay, we've implemented check-in and check-out at one of our elementary sites. Right now, we struggle with some of the other Tier 2 supports, like the basic FDA to BIP process. Our data is showing that check-in and check-out is effective for about 70 up to almost 80% of our students in the one site. We're using it in a second elementary site, and I don't have a report on there. I'm at the Early Learning Center, and we're in Tier 1, but I would like to start piloting some Tier 2 supports. Some of our 4K and 5K teachers tend to think that check-in and check-out may not be developmentally appropriate, so we did modify the sheet to match their concerns, but I hope to get that going as well.
Thanks for sharing. And we are going to come back to, I mean, I think I would put in a word of caution, you know, without the training and the structure to provide the systemic support for an intervention, I would just put out a word of caution before jumping too deeply into interventions. I know that people are always eager to try things out and see what's going to work, but I am a huge believer, and I think, you know, kind of the research around implementation really shows that you have to provide that within that healthy system. But having said that, I think we need, one of the things we'd like to do within these technical assistance sessions is really examine what are those core features of an intervention, such as check-in, check-out, and what are the, you know, not going beyond those technical pieces like the checking in and the forms and the data collection. What's actually about check-in, check-out that changes behavior, which I do think is developmentally appropriate K-12. You know, there are pieces that we can pull out from there, because I think, you know, some of the concerns on the flip side that from the high school perspective might be, well, check-in, check-out isn't really developmentally appropriate. You know, high school kids, this is just not cool. It's just not going to work for kids. And the reality is those critical components, the feedback, the engagement, the reinforcement, the reteaching, the prompting of skills, the additional structure, you know, all those types of things are things that do change behavior and do support students in new ways. So thank you for sharing. I mean, that's good insight. How about ladies and Nina, school site?
Yep. So we're implementing Tier 2 at 4 of our elementary buildings, and we 4 out of 9 elementary buildings in Neenah. And there's 3 that do follow. We have the decision rules, and we have, you know, specific rules for not only our Swiss data and ODRs, but then we also are using a behavioral screener 3 times a year with our students as well. And it's something that we've are just really starting this year. It's called the Savers. So we're incorporating some of that data into our decision rules as we're getting to learn the system as well. So we're really excited about that. But so far, you know, everything that you've talked about, I feel like we're right on the same page, and we're well on our way with those Tier 2 supports. And also, I mean, a lot of buildings have check-in, check-out. We have SAG groups up and running. And then also we're getting mentoring up and running in a lot of buildings as another intervention at Tier 2.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So hopefully we can kind of come back to those interventions, of, you know, maybe not so much specifically today, but eventually come back to how are those interventions working, and then how are they working with each other, you know, and how fluid are those supports provided and layered or not. And then what are those systems that support easy, efficient support for students? You know, how are we using our data? How are we building our staff capacity, et cetera? So hopefully we can help. Just, it sounds like you guys are on the right track, and hopefully we can help just continue to move you forward. So thank you for sharing. Go for it, Kent. Why don't you switch that slide up? So like I said before, you know, our universal expectations, our universal system is really what drives that Tier 2 support. So specifically, those expectations, they start from the ground level. You know, think about, I guess I'd ask you right now, think about your 3 to 5 expectations that are in the building. I mean, just take a second. Hopefully those are very easy to recall for all the schools that you support, even if there's multiple. And then what are those critical behaviors that are highlighted within the school-wide matrix or within classroom matrices? And what I would say is all of your Tier 2 supports really do need to come back to those. We need to come back to that common language that we've been teaching students and using with our staff since day one, since this was rolled out, since we created what our school was going to look like, you know, the Wilson way, or the, you know, however it was called and captured. because we're going to provide that kind of teaching and reinforcement at a higher rate, perhaps presented in a different way or a different way for students to engage with it. But that language is so critical. So sometimes, and I don't know if this is what's happening in your buildings, but sometimes our Tier 2 supports are being provided. We have social academic instructional groups, or we have prompts on our daily progress report that we want staff to use with students. And that language is not reflected in our school-wide matrix. And so I would ask, like, where can we kind of help, where can we reconcile the two? You know, are there things that need to be added within our matrix? Do we have, you know, prime real estate in our matrix? I consider all of that space, you know, that prime real estate. So are there things that are in there that are really not super critical? You know, most of the time, most students have this. We don't necessarily have to keep this in our matrix. Or do we need to add in some pieces or modify some language? And then on the flip side, you know, are our Tier 2 supports aligned with that language? So are there things that we need to do within our daily progress report and our feedback with students that aligns with that language that we use at Tier 1, so that it's not this whole new concept for our students and it's not this whole new concept for our staff to be teaching and going back to those core skills, teaching, reteaching, reinforcing, communicating with home about those particular skills, etc. Same is true for data. So, you know, what's coming up within our universal data will help drive our Tier 2 supports. So identification of needs, that will help us. We're going to look at the Tier 1 data, or those majors, minors, attendance, health room visits, to see, you know, if a student's in check-in, check-out, or social academic instructional groups as well. What's the other point of data? You know, the majors and minors. Can we do some sort of correlation between the two? Are they both showing that the student's making some improvement? And then how do we use that to inform our next steps? You know, are there slight modifications needed, or do we actually need to adjust and add on another intervention? But here's where this becomes really critical, because our data is really reliant upon the staff to collect it, the staff's understanding of collecting it and consistency. And we're at a point now where we want Tier 2 interventions and supports to be available for any and all students who might need it. Like Kent said, receiving this support is not a bad thing. So the thing is that we want to get to a point where staff don't get to choose whether or not students have access to this. The data is what chooses it. But the element of staff choice comes in with how staff use or do not use Tier 1 data. You know, if they do or do, if I'm a staff member that just doesn't really like writing minors or doesn't see the value in it, then my students won't, or maybe I use it only for like really big deal stuff, even though it's supposed to be for minor behaviors. The students in my class will not show up in the data rules and in our sorts when the Tier 2 team starts to problem solve, okay, which students need additional supports and who do not. So those are some additional considerations to think about, because we do want data to drive this practice, but the staff behavior and the staff support behind it is critical. The other piece is that the two are so fluid. The Tier 1, the Tier 2 supports are incredibly fluid and intertwined. So those students receiving Tier 2 support should still be having access to everything that's happening within Tier 1, within that universal, that reteaching, that teaching, the school-wide celebrations, the acknowledgement system. We layer on that support rather than remove it. Kent, anything you'd add?
Yeah, going back to the universal expectations, I think one of the things we also want to make sure that our staff are understanding, regardless of whether or not we're talking about this from Tier 1 or from Tier 2, Tier 3, the expectations that we have and the matrix that we use as our universal curriculum has a very specific purpose, and I don't think we really frequently talk about it. If you think about this in terms of college and career readiness, right? Our universal expectations, the matrix that we use, the behaviors that we're trying to teach to fluency in the settings are really the skills that the student needs to be successful within our setting, right? That it's not these things aren't being put into place because somebody said, oh, we need to have this in order for PBIS to work, right? That these are the skills that are critical to being successful within our setting. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about a classroom, or if we're talking school-wide setting, or if we're talking hallways, right? What skills do you need? How are we going to teach them, and how are we going to build fluency? That same logic continues into Tier 2. So when we talk about staff not being able to choose and not to deliver the intervention, really the supports are based on the idea that we are owning that Tier 1 collectively, that we are trying to get as many students as possible fluent in these skills and demonstrating these skills on a regular basis. The interventions are intended to support the students who have not responded to that really good, solid first teaching. So understanding that this isn't, warm and fuzzy and, puppy dogs, rainbows, and unicorns in terms of what PBIS is. This is really about helping students acquire the skills to be successful in our setting and beyond, and how have we built that, and then how do we support that. Okay.
Love it. Thank you. So the other assumptions that we make when we do provide Tier 2 supports is that our Tier 1 is really operating with fidelity. And now is the time of year we've got to pull out that self-assessment survey. So this is just a quick plug that if you haven't done so yet, think about with your team how that's going to get set up, and we're going to have all staff provide their voice and input into our implementation. And really help that drive our action planning through the rest of the year in terms of our communication and staff support. So the other piece, as you probably well know, is that benchmarks of quality or the tiered fidelity inventory, and really making sure that we are providing what we said we were going to provide. What are those critical elements that we need to have in place to make sure that, yep, our Tier 1 is pretty solid. And so we can make a safe decision that students who are demonstrating this need truly need this, and we can start to dig deeper into why that is and figure out how can we support them from our school, within our school and within our teaming. The other piece is that the classroom routines and procedures are in place, and that they're taught and they're retaught, and they're retaught, and they're taught on the fly, and they're also taught during protected time within the week or the month within that classroom. Oftentimes, I will be working with a school, and when we look at the teaching plan for the year, it includes, this isn't too often, but every once in a while, it includes that kickoff at the beginning of the year and a kickoff at second semester, and maybe one time in the month where we do some teaching. And that's great. It's a great place to start. But then the next piece becomes, where does the reteaching happen, and how are we making sure that it's systematic and systemic? It's built in. It's not something that we're leaving to chance. So within that classroom and within the universal, how are we using those expectations, demonstrated in our matrix? How are we teaching it, and then how are we flooding the system with those acknowledgments and making sure that students have had the opportunity to not only be taught and engage with the lesson, but reinforce at a high rate to learn that skill, or learn those skills that will help them be successful in the school. The other piece is that this is incredibly important to look at what are the referrals our students are getting, how are we defining those problem behaviors, and how are we even on the flip side defining our expectations, and how do we know that students are not being identified for Tier 2 supports because of a cultural mismatch? How are we doing that in a thoughtful way that it really is skill-based? It's something that a student needs to be successful in school, but while doing that, while honoring a student's culture. Kent, I know I'm kind of tripping up on my words here. I'm hoping you might be able to jump in and take that a few steps further.
Yeah, so when we think about this notion of cultural mismatch and the point of referral, we know through a lot of research nationwide that soft behaviors, subjective behaviors, tend to be a point for disproportionality, over-identification. So in this case, if we're talking culture equaling racial category that a student's enrolled in, we'll see patterns of behavior, things like students of color being referred for defiance and disrespect, whereas white students receive referral for attendance issues and fighting or physical aggression. What we want to look at when we're looking at that system conversation, who's coming into our interventions, are we seeing patterns in the data? Are we seeing those same patterns showing up? Like, we just had 10 kids that reached eligibility for Tier 2 support. 8 of them are students of color, and all 8 of them have received multiple office discipline referrals for defiance or disrespect. What this tells us, if we're seeing these patterns, or what this suggests to us, is that there may be a cultural mismatch between what the students know and have been taught from home and in the community and what is taking place in the classroom. So I tend to be more informal in how I operate. I don't have problems with people blurting out. But if I'm coming from a background where I expect everybody to raise their hand until they're called on, and I haven't necessarily taught that, or I haven't necessarily taught it to fluency in my class, I just assume all students know how to do this. But I have students that are coming from home and community and prior histories that say, if you got something to say it, right? This is where we're going to start seeing that conflict, because if the student is blurting out because it's what they know, and we haven't taught them the skills to be successful in my classroom setting, check and check out, the additional Tier 2 supports aren't going to work that well, right? Because we haven't addressed this fundamental mismatch. We haven't taught the student to fluency the skills necessary in that setting to be successful, right? And we haven't taught them how to do this thing called code switching. When that blurting out, when that kind of jumping in is okay in the class and in the routines, and when I really, really, really need you to raise your hand and wait to be called on. So checking for this mismatch is absolutely critical, because if we want the interventions to be successful, we need to make sure that the identification is not happening because of mismatch. Because like I said, if those patterns of mismatch are there and we're not addressing the underlying issues, the interventions aren't going to be as successful for the student or for the school. How's that?
That was good. That was really good. All right, progress monitoring. We know it's super critical. We have to do it so that we make sure that the student's actually making progress or not, and be able to adjust as necessary. And then the other piece that progress monitoring does, and hopefully your data system is able to do this. If not, we'll work with you and try to figure this out. But we want to look at collectively, are the majority of our students making progress in an intervention? So not just being able to pull out Emily, Kent, or Dave, but overall, how well are our students responding to the intervention? And at the bottom of the screen, you'll see that 70% rule. And I think Robert, who had to leave, he mentioned that he saw in their check and check out, or their interventions, yes, he said check and check out, that about 70 to 80% of students are responding. So that really kind of is a first check to see how healthy that intervention is and how well are we providing it. So for Heather and Elena, right, and Nina, how is your progress monitoring going with that? With being able to see not just individual students, but in the aggregate? Are you able to capture that and make decisions from it?
Yes. So, and I can only speak because I only have one building over the last couple of years that I'm doing Tier 2 at, but we have had, at least a 70% success rate with check and check out. But then other individual buildings are keeping track, so I'm not sure what where the other buildings are at. And Elena is a new school psych in all three of her other buildings. So we don't really have a way, and this is probably something we should do as a district, is to capture that district-wide and get more district-wide data on that. But overall, in my building, we do keep track of the success rate for each of our interventions by month, every month, and we keep monitoring that.
Quick question.
So,
Awesome.
Are y'all using Swiss?
we are.
You are. How many buildings are in your district?
How many buildings total?
Yeah.
Or in Swiss? How many buildings total or in Swiss?
In total. Well, how many buildings are implementing, I guess?
Okay, implementing Tier 2. So there's 4 buildings implementing Tier 2, but only 3 of them are using Swiss.
Okay. Okay. There is a tool in the Swiss suite that allows you as a district to look at all of the implementing buildings that you have data on.
Okay.
The tool is called PBIS Evaluations, PBIS Eval. I think for a district, it's a 2-year license for $500. It's like an hour online training once you sign a license for it, but it really will let you look at Tier 1 and Tier 2 data across the district. It'll allow you to build cohorts within your system.
Okay.
So, your buildings that have been implementing for 3 years versus your 1-year buildings. It'll pull up into your triangle data. It'll pull up your Tier 2 snapshots, kind of any data that you want to look at, you're able to play with within evaluations.
Okay, so it's called PBIS evaluation. So that system in and of itself is the extra $500?
Correct.
Is that what you're saying? Okay. Okay. Is that something new, or have they had that before?
No, it's been around for a while.
Oh.
It's just not something that's ever really been talked about a lot, because most schools hadn't reached critical mass where it was useful for them yet.
Okay.
We use it in the center it's one of our data sources for our database that allows us to look at different combinations. It's pretty useful.
Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, Emilie, I jumped in.
No, I'm glad you did. I mean, I was like, in my head, I was trying to think through easy ways that you could do that, because I think that would offer a really cool district perspective, especially if the psychs are looking at one thing in particular, the external coaches, or however your support structures are set up. That would be a really interesting point of discussion. And then I guess in terms of, examining staff supports or, additional resources needed, it would just be a really interesting point of data. So cool. Well, why don't we go to the next piece? If there's anything about progress monitoring, let me know. But we could go to that next slide, Kent.
I did.
Oh, perfect. There we go. Sorry, I'm trying to split my screen here. The other piece, I guess, is really about that fading piece, that Tier 2 was never really intended to be that life sentence. Students shouldn't be hanging out and check out for a couple of semesters with little or no change to their support. And then the other piece is same thing with social academic instructional groups. Mentoring does tend to be it can be more ongoing. It can also be a little bit more short term. But I think that we really want to look at thoughtful fading, so that it includes some self-monitoring. It includes kind of that gradual release of responsibility, because we've put these structures up in place, the staff members have, to kind of help provide that predictability, that structure, that feedback for the students. And so how can we help support them in doing that on their own? How's that going for you and Nina in terms of fading from interventions, layering easily, helping students self-monitor? What kinds of things have you tried and are finding that are working?
Well, I could speak for the one building that I'm at. I think we do a nice job of layering on interventions. You know, there's students that if they need check and check out, they receive it. SAG as well, and our SAG groups are generally 6 weeks. In addition then to mentoring, we try to really match students with the interventions that they need, and but we don't hesitate to layer on if they need additional supports. As far as fading the interventions away, we really haven't done too much with self-monitoring with students, but that would be something to certainly look into. We just try to back away from supports or maybe do a check and check out a little less frequently. Maybe they're checking in with their check and check out teacher just a couple times a week and just really monitoring their progress to see if they're still being able to maintain the progress that they have made. So we just kind of look at each individual student and what's going to make sense for them and working with the tutor as well. But we haven't really done too much with the student self-monitoring.
Okay. Well, I think, I do think that fading can take lots of different forms, like you just said, kind of decreasing the frequency of a greeter or the prompts provided throughout the day is one way to do it, with that ultimate goal of students, kind of slowly releasing it back and seeing, what pieces that were critical for the students and what pieces are they ready to let go of, and what might they still need or not need. But I think, but, ultimately it shares the same goal in that can students start to do this on their own? Are they more aware? Are they able to provide those kinds of pieces of support that they need just on their own, and build that skill? So cool. Well, I mean, it sounds like you've got some great strategies to rely on and to think about. And building in that self-reflection piece for the student might be a place to go for this year. But if it's working for you and working for the students and you're able to pay them appropriately, I'd say don't mess with it,
There really isn't, kind of like you said, there really isn't a right or wrong way to do this. What we want ultimately is for the students to be able to kind of wow. Sorry. Assess themselves and their accordingly. So I'm going to mute myself.
No worries. Oh, I'm getting it too. I think it might be Heather. I'm not sure if you're able to mute yourself, but maybe we can try it that way. Oh, it just got better. You might have just moved the mic or something, but it just got better. So thank you. So we always provide supports based on that need. The data will tell us. If we dig deeper, hopefully our data systems are robust enough that we can look into this more deeply and see when we can fade. If the student's not responding to the intervention, how can we dig more deeply into our data to see, is this a skill deficit? Is it a performance deficit? So does the student know how to do it, but they're just not quite sure when? Their timing is always a little off, or they're just not quite sure on picking up cues, and we need to kind of boost that performance, that in the moment skill performance. And then the other piece is the engagement and motivation. So is it because of a lack of motivation or a lack of engagement within the materials, with peers, with adults, within the classroom? And how can we build those additional supports in? That other piece of unknown, Kent, I'm curious what you were going to say about that, or what you would say about that with the, we're just not sure piece. My gut is that we go with what we can, with what we do know, and we layer as appropriate. And hopefully, as we move forward, we see some improvement with the student, and continue to provide that support, which would give us additional data. But what else would you say about that unknown piece?
Unknown is kind of a trigger for a couple different things. It's one of the things that I'm always listening to in the schools I support or when I train. When they're looking at their data initially, if they're not able to pull their data sets and say, oh, okay, here's the pattern that I'm seeing. We're seeing a problem across the board around this particular expectation, or we're seeing problem behavior occurring always within particular context where there's a strong literacy component. Really, we want people to be able to slow their thinking down, be able to look at the data and figure out what's the data telling us. Unknown, when I hear it, is always a prompt to kind of have the team look back at what the data is saying, both the tier 1 data, where the error is occurring. So where are we having continuous minors? How is the DPR looking? What's the whole big data picture telling us? And if we still really, really, really can't get a good picture based on the data points that we have, unknown also becomes a trigger for moving into that brief FBA to really kind of slow down our processing, our thinking, and really start trying to analyze when the problem behaviors are occurring, what happens just before it, what happens immediately after it, and how is it being maintained by the setting. So unknown is kind of put there as a reminder for systems to kind of think about, do we have enough data and we just need to dig into it? Or do we need to move into that next piece of trying to collect a little bit more based on what we have? So it was a catch. It was a trigger, Emily. How's that?
I love it. That's great. So words. Any questions or thoughts or feedback? Anything that you have additional for us? I know we have just a few minutes left before 1 o'clock, and time is very precious. But anything from you over in Nina?
No, I think this was a great review of information, and it was very helpful. But I don't think we have any specific questions at this time.
Okay.
So
later on, go ahead, Ken.
So I wanted to just try to get a little bit of feedback from you. What we had envisioned over the next couple of these was to start unpacking kind of not only the DPR and how do we give feedback, but also unpacking the interventions as well. Does that sound kind of like what you would hope to get from continued participation in these, or would you like something else in terms of this format?
So unpacking what you mean by just like reviewing some key components of like DPR and
but
specific
moving
intervention.
beyond the technical pieces of it to really kind of, why is it set up this way? What does it mean for the school? How does a building own it? How does it look? Those kinds of things. Not just how do you build it and who makes a good greeter and what's the scoring on a DPR like.
I think it would be a helpful review, and I don't know, I have Elena here, and I explained before that Elena is new to Tier 2, so maybe I don't know if Elena, you feel like that would be helpful, or?
Yeah, I definitely think it would be helpful. I mean, especially being new to the system and new to PBIS world. Somebody in my shoes, I feel like I could take a lot away from that.
Okay. Good. Thanks for the feedback. Sorry, Emily.
Yeah. No, that's kind of where I was going to go as well. It's just that I think in the future we're looking to kind of, rather than, like Ken said, getting really specific about how to do an intervention, really looking at those systemic components, or those systemic pieces that really support interventions, or, kind of going deeper behind some of the meaning and how to shift practice to follow the supports that we're looking for. So, yeah, if anything, now's the time. Do your self-assessment surveys if you haven't set those up yet. Ken or I or your technical assistance coordinator, who's in Nina. Let's see, that would be Stephanie Skolasinski and Michelle Polzine. Would be more than happy, or Dan Seaman. Yep, they would be great people to connect with if you need any additional supports as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yep, we're on track to take the TFI in November.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Can't wait to hear how that goes.
Yeah.
I love watching schools react when they're like, "This is awesome." Sorry.
We started it last year, and it worked out really well. Definitely better than having so many other assessments, so many separate assessments. It's nice to have it in one. So it's worked well. Just a question. So I know there's multiple more webinars, and is it about like, is it once every month that these are set up for?
Yeah, we built them about every 6 weeks
Okay.
to try to make
Okay.
sure that we're not taking too much time out of your buildings and stuff like that.
Sure. Now let's say if we're not able to make the next one, like, is it something we can kind of jump into throughout the year if we,
Yes.
know?
Yeah,
Okay.
what we're planning on trying to do is build these as kind of standalone things, but also kind of sequential. So, if you can't make the one on check and check out, but you're able to make the one on SAIG, that's fine. You're not going to miss out. It's not going to throw you off or anything. We're
And
also,
so will we know what the specific topic will be for
yeah,
each one?
yeah. What I think we're going to do is anybody that's registered, we'll send a reminder email to through that registration link and say, all right, and this is what our topic is going to be,
Okay.
both as a reminder and kind of foreshadowing to respect people's time.
Okay.
We'll
Okay.
also be posting these on our video resources section. So, if you can't make a session, but really we're dying to hear, what other people are talking about, you'll be able to pull it down too.
Okay, and that's on the Wisconsin PBIS network?
Yeah. I think right now the easiest way to do it would be to use the search box and just type in video resources.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good to know.
Cool. Well, thank you
Well,
for
thank you.
joining us, ladies.
Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Thank you for all the great info.
Have a good
Yeah. Well, have a good weekend. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.